The CEO called me just a secretary before ignoring a $78 million deal's deadly loophole. My revenge was, and then. That day is etched in my mind like a scene from a movie. Every detail as clear as if it happened yesterday. I was at the far end of the glossy mahogany conference table, meticulously stacking fresh acquisition documents in a thick leather binders. The room buzzed with an unspoken tension, a cocktail of polished wood scent, faint traces of cologne, and the intoxicating hum of power that only a corporate boardroom can hold. At the head of the table sat Troy, the CEO of Barrow Global, a man who ruled this empire with a sneer and a swagger, wearing arrogance like a second skin. His eyes scanned the room, landing on me with that unmistakable flicker of disdain. "Claire," he said, voice dripping with condescension, "you're not a lawyer. Maybe stick to organizing papers instead of pretending to understand contracts." A few executives chuckled, their laughter sharp and mocking. My face flushed hot, but I refused to let him see me falter. I set the binder down carefully and nodded, but inside, a fire was igniting. I'd been with Barrow Global for nearly a decade, quietly climbing the ranks from assistant to the person who knew every hidden detail buried in 1,000 pages of legalese. Yet here I was, still dismissed as invisible furniture. The meeting was the climax of months of work, the company's biggest acquisition yet, a German logistics firm worth $78 million. The executives were practically buzzing with excitement, already envisioning the headlines and bonuses. Troy soaked up the praise like a king ready to claim his throne. But my eyes were fixed on a tiny, overlooked clause near the back of the contract, a dormant license provision, seemingly insignificant, yet potentially fatal to the entire deal. I leaned forward, voice low but steady. "There's something here on page 289, subsection C. It could allow a third party to claim licensing rights before the acquisition closes." Troy barely glanced at the page, then laughed, a cold, dismissive sound that cut through the room. "Claire, we have 3 Ivy League lawyers on this. If they don't see a problem, neither do I. Besides, I don't pay you to question decisions. Stick to your job." The room fell silent, save for a few uneasy chuckles. I swallowed the bitter taste of humiliation, but met his gaze squarely. For years, I'd accepted moments like this, the sneers, the silence, the glass ceiling pressing down hard. But this was different. This was reckless. This was negligence that could cost the company everything. And I was done staying silent. That night, after the building emptied and the fluorescent lights dimmed, I stayed behind. The janitors passed by without a glance, the office's usual quiet broken only by the hum of the air conditioning. I wasn't drafting notes or prepping for another meeting. I was digging through the contract line by line, tracing every clause, every cross-reference, every hidden footnote. What I found chilled me. The dormant license clause was no myth. It was real, enforceable, and hadn't been removed for over 25 years. It allowed any third party to pay a nominal fee, just $2, and claim rights to the core software that powered the German firm's entire logistics network. It was a backdoor, left open by careless lawyers, and no one had noticed. My hands shook, but not from fear. It was exhilaration, pure and sharp. The real power in this company wasn't in the corner office or the boardroom. It was in understanding the fine print that everyone else ignored. I knew I had to act, but carefully. Timing was everything. The deal was supposed to close in less than a week, and Troy had no clue that I was about to pull the rug out from under him. The next morning, the office buzzed with its usual frenetic energy, coffee brewing, keyboards clicking, murmured conversations blending into a familiar white noise. I sat at my desk, looking every bit the quiet administrative coordinator who never caused waves. But tucked away in my bag was a stack of documents that felt like a secret weapon, a notarized claim form, a check for $2, and a filing confirming my right to that dormant license. I'd called in a favor from Nina, my college friend turned corporate compliance expert, who confirmed that the loophole was binding and legally sound. At precisely 1:15 p.m., during my lunch break, I walked into a small government office in Milwaukee. The notary, a sharp-eyed woman with a knowing smirk, watched as I signed the paperwork and handed over the cash. "Good luck," she said quietly. I smiled back, feeling the weight of what I'd just set in motion. I'm going to need it. Returning to Barrow Global, everything looked the same. Troy barking orders through the glass walls, the CFO laughing about golf scores, marketing gossiping about weekend plans. But beneath the surface, the world was shifting. For 2 days, I waited in anxious silence. Had I misread the clause? Was I about to be fired, sued, or worse? Then, on the third morning, everything changed. A sharply dressed lawyer stormed into Troy's office. Voices rose, and the acquisition ground to a halt. Whispered rumors filled the halls. Someone had filed a claim, and the deal was frozen. That afternoon, Troy walked past my desk without so much as a glance. The man who had dismissed me with contempt days before was no longer so sure of himself. I went home that night with my heart pounding, not from fear, but from a fierce, electric certainty. The fight had just begun, and I was no longer invisible. I had become the problem Troy didn't know how to solve. After filing that claim, the world around me didn't just change, it flipped upside down. Suddenly, the quiet corners of the office where I once felt invisible became arenas of whispered speculation and sharp glances. Everyone I passed seemed to know something I didn't, though no one dared say it out loud. The legal team's panic was almost tangible. I could see it in the way they clustered in corners, speaking in hushed tones, eyes darting nervously toward Troy's office. It was clear this loophole was no small problem. It was a bomb waiting to explode. My phone buzzed with a message from Mina just as I was about to step into a meeting. Confirmed. The dormant license clause is ironclad. No wiggle room. Her words hit me like a thunderclap. I had hoped this was just a technicality, something that could be smoothed over with legal jargon and corporate muscle. Instead, it was a hammer, poised to bring the whole deal crashing down. But the weight of responsibility didn't crush me, it fueled me. I knew I held a power few ever grasped, the power of the fine print. Later that day, I overheard snippets of conversation in the break room. Who could have filed that claim? One associate whispered. It's unprecedented, another replied, voice low. The tension was suffocating. I wasn't just a name on a form anymore. I was the person everyone feared. That realization was both terrifying and exhilarating. I took care to remain composed, blending into the background as if nothing had changed. But inside, I was ready for whatever battle lay ahead. Troy's behavior shifted dramatically. Gone was the cocky CEO who had dismissed me with a sneer. Now, he was a man calculating his next move, his jaw tight, eyes sharp with frustration. I caught him once staring out the window, hands clenched into fists as if trying to physically contain his anger. It was clear he understood the threat I posed, even if he refused to acknowledge it openly. The boardroom, once his kingdom, had become a cage tightening around him, and I was the key to its lock. One afternoon, just as the sun cast long shadows across the office floor, I received the call I'd been anticipating. Troy's voice crackled through the phone, tense but controlled. Claire, come to my office. Now. There was no room for negotiation or delay. I straightened my blazer, took a deep breath, and walked the familiar path to the glass door that marked his territory. The corridor felt different this time, charged with expectation, heavy with silent judgment. When I entered, Troy was standing by the window, his back to me, staring out at the city skyline, as if searching for a way to escape the mess I had created. He turned slowly, his expression unreadable. Have a seat, he said, voice calm but edged with steel. I complied, sitting across from him with a steady gaze that refused to waver. He didn't smile. Instead, he began speaking slowly, carefully choosing his words. You filed a dormant license claim against this acquisition. I was told it was you. I nodded. I did. The clause is valid, and the claim is binding. His eyes darkened with a mix of disbelief and anger. You blindsided this company and jeopardized a deal worth millions. I met his gaze evenly. I followed the contract. You ignored the warning. I did what was necessary. There was a long pause, the silence thick enough to cut with a knife. Then Troy's demeanor shifted. He sat down behind his desk, fingers steepled, like a poker player sizing up his opponent. You want something. Money. A buyout. Name your price. I tilted my head, refusing to be rattled. I didn't file this for money. I did it because you treated me like I didn't exist. Because you ignored the risks. His confident facade faltered for a moment before he recovered. You realize this won't end well for you. I nodded, feeling a surge of defiance. And it won't end well for you either. That conversation marked the beginning of a new phase. Retaliation came quickly. Access to my work computer was cut off without warning, replaced by a stark red screen demanding I contact IT. HR summoned me for a formal inquiry, accusing me of unauthorized interference and breach of trust. It was a classic corporate playbook move. Smear the opponent, isolate them, make them appear rogue. But I wasn't unarmed. Days before filing the claim, I'd hired an attorney. When I forwarded the HR email to him, He assured me we were ready to fight back with every legal tool available. Despite the pressure, I refused to crumble. I kept my head down, continued coming to work each day with a calm professionalism that unsettled even my harshest critics. Rumors swirled around me, whispers of how a low-level administrator had managed to shake the foundations of one of the biggest deals in company history. But no one could pin anything on me because I'd followed the letter of the law. My paper trail was airtight. Every move I made was documented, legal, and above board. As the days passed, the atmosphere in the office shifted. The usual confident chatter gave way to anxious murmurs. Executives exchanged worried glances. Even the usually unflappable CFO avoided eye contact. The board called emergency meetings, consulting outside counsel and reviewing internal processes. I stayed out of sight, but watched closely. Every shift in power, every faltering step by Troy was a small victory. I wasn't just fighting for myself anymore. I was fighting for accountability and respect in a world that had long ignored me. Then, unexpectedly, I got a call from the chairman of the board, Ronald. He wanted to meet in person. I walked into the glass-walled conference room on the top floor, feeling a strange mix of nerves and determination. Ronald listened patiently as I laid out everything. The ignored warnings, the loophole, the reckless dismissal, the retaliation. I spoke calmly, presenting documents and facts without emotion. When I finished, Ronald leaned back, steepling his fingers thoughtfully. "You've put us in a difficult position," he said slowly. I met his eyes. "No, sir. That was done long before I stepped in. I simply followed the law." He nodded, acknowledging the truth. "You're not wrong. We have a lot to consider. For now, I ask you to refrain from speaking to the press." I smiled politely. "I'm not looking for headlines. I'm seeking accountability." Leaving that meeting, I felt the weight of the coming storm, but also a flicker of hope. The game had changed. I wasn't invisible anymore. I had made my move, and the world was watching. The days that followed were a blur of hushed conversations, cold stares, and cautious steps around the office. It felt as if I had become a specter haunting the hallways, invisible to some but impossible to ignore for others. The sudden shift in atmosphere was palpable. Where once people casually greeted me, now they barely met my eyes. The quiet whispers were impossible to escape, spreading faster than wildfire. Claire had shaken the foundations of Barrow Global, and no one quite knew how to respond. Yet, despite the mounting tension, I refused to back down or show any sign of weakness. Troy's fury was a living thing. I could see it in the way his jaw clenched whenever our paths crossed, the forced calm in his voice when he addressed me during meetings, and the strategic silence that followed my every word. He was a man used to control, accustomed to unquestioned authority, and suddenly that power was slipping through his fingers. His attempts to regain dominance were relentless. He called me into his office more times than I cared to count, each meeting a calculated blend of thinly veiled threats and offers disguised as negotiations. "Name your price, Claire," he said once, voice low but cutting through the air like a blade. "We can make this go away. Clean, quiet, no trouble for anyone." I met his gaze steadily and replied, "I didn't file the claim for money, Troy. I did it because you ignored me when it mattered most." The retaliation from HR was swift and merciless. One morning, I arrived at my desk to find my computer access revoked without explanation. Instead of the familiar desktop, a stark red warning screen stared back at me, demanding immediate contact with the IT department. Not long after, I was summoned to a formal inquiry. The accusation was clear: unauthorized interference with company operations, insubordination, and breach of trust. It was a classic tactic: paint me as a rogue agent, someone acting out of spite rather than principle. But I was prepared. Days before, I had hired an attorney, understanding that this battle would not be fought alone. I forwarded every email, every accusation to my lawyer, and in return, received clear, firm assurances that we had the upper hand. Despite the mounting pressure, I continued showing up every day with quiet determination. I wore my calm like armor, refusing to give my detractors the satisfaction of seeing me falter. I kept meticulous records of everything: every email, every meeting, every slight. The lines of defense I built were unbreakable. The more they tried to isolate me, the more I clung to the truth and the law. Rumors circulated, growing louder and more frantic. People questioned how someone in my position could have wielded such influence. They whispered about the board's emergency meetings, about outside counsel being brought in to handle the crisis. Yet no one could dispute the facts. I had followed the contract to the letter, and I held the legal documents to prove it. The atmosphere in the office grew increasingly tense, like a storm about to break. Executives who once commanded rooms now avoided my gaze, shifting uncomfortably whenever I entered. The usual buzz of confident conversation had given way to cautious speculation and nervous glances. Even the CFO, a man known for his unwavering composure, looked uneasy when our paths crossed. The boardroom had become a battleground, with Troy's influence waning under the weight of scrutiny and internal dissent. Meanwhile, I remained steadfast in my seat outside the spotlight, watching the tide turn with a mixture of satisfaction and wary anticipation. Then came the unexpected call from Ronald, the chairman of the board. His voice was calm, authoritative, and carried the weight of finality. "Claire, I need to see you. It's important." The glass-walled conference room on the top floor was cold and impersonal, but I felt a strange surge of resolve as I took my seat across from him. Ronald was a man who listened without judgment, who weighed facts carefully and spoke rarely, but with conviction. I laid out everything: the ignored warnings, the dormant license clause, Troy's reckless dismissal, and the retaliatory measures I had endured. I spoke with clarity, backed by documents and an unwavering commitment to the truth. When I finished, Ronald steepled his fingers and sighed deeply. "You've put us in a difficult position, Claire." I met his gaze evenly and replied, "No, sir. The difficult position was created long before I took any action. I simply followed the law." He nodded slowly, acknowledging the uncomfortable truth. "You are not wrong. We have much to consider. For now, I ask that you refrain from speaking to the press." I gave a small, polite smile and said, "I'm not seeking headlines, Mr. Ronald. I'm seeking accountability." He returned the smile, tempered with respect. "Understood. We will be in touch." Walking out of that meeting, I felt the weight of everything pressing down on me, but also a flicker of hope. The game had changed. I was no longer just the quiet administrator. They had no choice but to recognize me as a player. The fight was far from over, but for the first time, I sensed that I was no longer on the defensive. I had taken control of the narrative, and the world was finally watching. The morning that followed the board meeting, the atmosphere at Barrow Global felt charged, as if the entire company was holding its breath, waiting to see what would come next. The usual hum of activity was replaced by a cautious quiet, punctuated by the soft shuffle of footsteps and the occasional murmur of low voices. It was clear that Troy's reign had been shaken and that the wheels of change were slowly turning. The glass walls of the executive suite were closed, blinds drawn, signaling a new era of secrecy and tension. For the first time, the power that once seemed untouchable was vulnerable. Within hours, the news came down from the board. Troy was placed on administrative leave, pending further review. The announcement was carefully worded, leaving no room for speculation about the gravity of the situation. It was a silent signal that the company was no longer willing to tolerate the reckless arrogance that had nearly cost them millions. For many, it was a shock. For me, it was a moment of quiet vindication. The man who had dismissed me so casually was now sidelined, his authority stripped away by the very consequences he had ignored. The board appointed Ronald as interim CEO, a man whose calm authority and measured approach promised stability. He moved quickly to rebuild trust within the company, insisting on transparency and accountability at every level. To my surprise, Ronald personally invited me to join the new negotiation team tasked with overseeing the acquisition. This was no token gesture. He wanted someone who understood the risks, someone who could read between the lines of contracts and hold the company to a higher standard. When he offered me the role of Director of Strategic Risk, I was both humbled and resolute. I made it clear that I would accept only if given real authority, not just a title, but the power to enforce compliance and speak freely without bureaucratic interference. Ronald agreed without hesitation. "Consider it done," he said with a faint smile. Over the next few weeks, I worked side by side with legal teams and compliance officers, scrutinizing every clause and negotiating terms with a renewed sense of purpose. The acquisition process, once riddled with oversight and arrogance, became methodical and thorough. Hanover's attorneys, representing the German firm, were cautious but cooperative, impressed by the level of detail and integrity we now demanded. When the deal finally closed, it was airtight. No loopholes, no shortcuts, no ego-driven mistakes. The story made waves in industry circles, not for the size of the deal, but for the quiet revolution it represented. For once, a corporate giant had closed a deal with integrity, without burying its failures beneath layers of spin and silence. One evening, after the final documents were signed and the conference room emptied, I found myself alone, staring out at the city skyline as the sun dipped below the horizon. 8 years. 8 years of being underestimated, dismissed, and overlooked. I had started this job believing that hard work alone would earn respect, but I learned the hard truth. Respect isn't given, it's taken. You claim it. You stand firm when others expect you to fold. And most importantly, you recognize your own worth before anyone else ever will. A few minutes later, Ronald joined me, carrying 2 cups of coffee. He offered one with a knowing smile. "The board's been talking," he said, settling into the chair across from me. I raised an eyebrow, wary of what was coming next. "That sounds ominous." He chuckled softly. "Not ominous. Encouraging. They want you to stay, not just for compliance work, but in a newly created role, Director of Risk and Contract Strategy. You'll report directly to the executive board." I blinked, stunned. "That's a real position?" He nodded, a glint of sincerity in his eyes. "It is now." I exhaled slowly, overwhelmed but grateful. "Why me?" I asked quietly. His smile softened. "Because you didn't just protect this company from financial disaster. You protected it from itself. And you did it without seeking credit, revenge, or personal gain." I studied him for a moment, feeling the weight of those words settle deep within me. "Thank you," I said quietly. He nodded, confident. "You earned it." The next morning, I moved into my new office, a modest space, without corner windows or a grand title on the door. And I was perfectly okay with that. This wasn't about status or recognition. It was about having a voice and making sure no one else in this company would ever have to fight alone just to be heard. The battles I had fought weren't just for me. They were for every person silenced by arrogance and disregard. As for Troy, the last I heard, he had accepted a consulting role at a smaller firm in Dallas, far from the headlines and high stakes of Barrow Global. Whether he had learned anything from the fall, I couldn't say, but it no longer mattered to me. Some battles are fought for survival, some for principle, and some because walking away means accepting that things will never change. I refused to accept that. I didn't set out to win a war. I simply refused to lose quietly. And in the end, that made all the difference. Just when I thought the storm had passed and the company was finally steering toward calmer waters, I received a message that shattered any illusion of peace I had hoped for. It came late one evening, the kind of message that makes your chest tighten and your mind race in a way no calm night should ever invite. It was from Troy, the man who had once ruled Barrow Global with an iron fist, now reduced to a ghost haunting the outskirts of corporate power. His words were brief but heavy. "You haven't won yet." At first, I thought it was just empty bravado, a last desperate attempt to rattle me. But the truth was far more unsettling. Within days, news broke that Troy had joined a rival logistics firm based in Dallas, a much smaller operation, but one with ambitions as vast as his ego. Worse, he was spearheading a takeover of a crucial subcontractor, one that controlled a key piece of technology Barrow Global desperately relied on: the exclusive rail operations software. If Troy succeeded, he could destabilize everything we had fought so hard to secure. I sat at my desk, the hum of the office fading into the background as I pored over the contracts and agreements governing that subcontractor relationship. The documents were dense and labyrinthine, filled with clauses and subclauses designed to protect both parties, yet hiding vulnerabilities like landmines beneath the surface. Then, buried in the fine print of a data-sharing agreement from nearly 20 years ago, I found it. Another dormant clause, nearly identical to the one I had uncovered in the acquisition contract. It was a legal loophole, almost forgotten, yet potent enough to grant substantial control to an outside party if properly claimed. My heart pounded as I realized the gravity of the situation. The clock was ticking again, and the stakes had never been higher. If I didn't act fast, Troy would gain leverage that could undo everything we had built, and the company might never recover. I reached for the filing forms, my hands steady despite the whirlwind inside my head. I prepared to file the claim preemptively, just as I had done before. But then, I hesitated. I contacted the regulatory office where such claims were processed, ready to confirm my submission. That's when I received the shock. The clerk informed me that the claim had already been filed, an hour before I even began the paperwork. My breath caught, and my mind raced through every possible explanation. Who could have beaten me to it? Then the name came through loud and clear. Nina, my trusted friend and former compliance advisor. the person who had helped me verify the first dormant clause. My fingers trembled as I stared at the screen, disbelief mixing with a cold surge of betrayal. Nina, the person I had counted on, had blindsided me. I stared at my phone in stunned silence, the office around me fading away. How could she have done this? What had changed between us that I hadn't noticed? 1,000 questions flooded my mind, each heavier than the last. Finally, unable to hold back, I picked up the phone and called her. The line rang once, twice, before she answered, her voice calm but tense. "Claire," she said, "we need to talk." My voice was steadier than I felt. "You've got 5 minutes, Nina." Convince me this wasn't betrayal. The pause on the other end stretched long and thick, filled with unspoken truths and fractured trust. When she finally spoke, it wasn't a denial or a justification. It was a confession. She revealed a secret I hadn't known, a shadowed deal she had been working on behind the scenes, one that forced her hand and set her on a collision course with me. She painted a picture of impossible choices, of loyalties divided and pressure that no one outside our circle could understand. The conversation ended without resolution, leaving me suspended between disbelief and reluctant understanding. The war wasn't over. If anything, it had just begun in a new and more personal way. I was no longer just fighting a corporate giant or a ruthless CEO. Now, I was fighting someone I had once trusted, someone whose actions threatened to unravel everything I had worked so hard to build. The stakes were higher than ever, and the lines between ally and adversary blurred into shades of gray. I sat back, the city lights twinkling through the window behind me, and realized that this battle wouldn't be won with documents or legal claims alone. It would demand strategy, courage, and a resilience that went beyond the office walls. As the silence settled, I knew one thing for certain. I wouldn't lose. Not quietly, not ever. This was far from the end. It was a new beginning, and I was ready to face whatever came next with everything I had.